chilly here.
Wonderful.
The Mexico Institute and the Inter-American Dialogue are delighted to present to you today the launch of a new book from John Bailey, The Politics of Crime in Mexico. It is a particular delight for us to have John with us, longtime collaborator and friend of both institutions. I know that Michael Shifter will be saying more about that a little bit later on. From my own point of view, I've known John for just over 18 years, I imagine. We met first of all in Mexico City in 1996, when John came down for a student conference that we'd organized between students of Carleton, ETAM, and Georgetown. And I had the great pleasure of getting to know him then and recognized him for what he is, which is a great scholar and a true gentleman. And John has been of help to many of us throughout the years. And although you have recently retired from your professional activities, as it were, at Georgetown, we hope that you remain engaged, because we very much value your opinions and the help that you continue to give us. We have a packed event today, and we don't actually have that much time. We only have an hour and a half. We originally advertised this event as being a 2-hour event, but in fact we have to clear this auditorium at 10:30. So I will not say that much. We've got people who are going to say incredible things. We've got Flier Brown, Michael Shifter, Claire Rimando Silke. I love saying your name like Silke, Silke, and of course John himself. Let me just say a couple of very brief words to begin with. First of all, for those of you who are watching on the internet, on the webcast, please follow the conversation and tweet in your questions if you have any. We'd be delighted to accept them. You can either tag it with the @Mexico Institute, @The Dialogue, or the hashtag #CrimeInMex. We have a book that is unfortunately not in front of you, because the publisher wasn't able to get us copies of the book because they didn't have anybody who could sell them to you. But we do have a very special offer for you today, which is that if you pick up one of these outside, you'll get an incredible discount on it. What's more, because I was raised in the East End of London selling fruit from a barrow, I will throw in an extra offer. I will give you a copy of our latest book, Building Resilient Communities in Mexico, which is on civic responses to organized crime. And if you're really, really good, then you'll get an invitation to the next Mexico Institute event. Okay? So, I mean, we can't really do fairer than that. Yeah. I mean, I could do it in Mexican style, de a peso, de a peso, de a peso, but well, let's move on. The book itself, of course, is about the politics of crime in Mexico, and many people have focused on the dimension of organized crime. But one of the terrific things about this book is it goes beyond that, because it is really about the culture of impunity in Mexico. It's about the security trap, and as John will explain in much greater detail and much more eloquently than myself, it touches upon the fluidity of crime in Mexico. Fluidity in the sense of it being, of it moving geographically, fluidity in the sense of the kind of crime. And in my experience of living in Mexico and studying Mexico, we've seen this happen many, many times. We've seen the transition, of course, from the crime years of the mid to late 1990s, of kidnapping, express kidnapping, extortion, etc. So the rise of much more violent crime at the end of the 1990s and in the 2000s. And then we've seen this kind of change and mutate throughout the country. And we've seen, of course, geographic variation of the kinds of crime in Mexico. And I associate a lot of this geographic variation with the process of decentralization. The argument that's been made by Alejandro Hope, of course, in Mexico, which is that the process of decentralization that began 20, 25 years ago in Mexico has meant that each of the individual states of Mexico is differently equipped to respond to the challenge of organized crime. And we've seen that this challenge for the states in terms of the strength of their institutions has been a crucial factor in determining the spread of crime and the depth of criminal activity across the country. This ties directly into the broader theme of the book, of course, which is democratization and the process of democratization that continues in Mexico. Most of us tend to think of Mexico as a democratic country. Of course, Mexicans themselves constantly say we are still in transition. And this transition process, which goes on and faces new challenges, of course, with each government. The process of decentralization that we saw throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, we're now seeing a counter tendency in Mexico, the re-centralization. And part of that the argument behind that re-centralization of power is the response to crime and the need to re-establish the control of the state. One case which I think is particularly important and in understanding is the case of Baja California, and looking at what happened up there when we've seen not necessarily a cycle, but a transition in terms of crime and criminal activity. From the violent years of the 1990s, we saw a successful response from the state and federal and municipal level governments. Violence levels have dropped dramatically in Baja California, but that didn't mean that crime went away. We saw a rise in bank robberies, robberies from 7-Elevens, OXXO stores, etc. And then one of the most fascinating things I think we've seen is the way that the private sector has responded to that rise in crime in Baja California by installing video cameras in banks and in OXXO stores that are directly linked to police stations. And this caused a drop in crime that was very, very rapid in that kind of crime in Baja California. Because criminals are not idiots generally. I mean, some of them are. We've all seen those cases on sort of the Darwin Awards where people make horrible mistakes in the middle of criminal activity. But criminals learn very, very quickly. And so criminals in Baja California have moved their activity from banks, from OXXO stores, into house burglaries, where there is less technology, where there's less capacity on the part of civil society to respond to it. And this fluidity, of course, all points to the fact that crime is not going to go away. Crime is going to be with us for a long, long time in Mexico. And so coming back to the question of democratic governance in a security trap, it's incredibly difficult to escape from this trap once you're in there. John, I would like you to sort of pick up from where I left off there and to pick up and explain to the audience what the book is all about. I would like to give you my personal congratulations.
Thanks.
And thanks very much for letting us present this book here today.
Thank you very much. I want to thank, I really appreciate the joint sponsorship of the dialogue and the Institute. It's really very good. And Brookings pitched in, I think, very helpfully as well. I have a PowerPoint. I don't know whether it's loaded and ready to go, but that could be kind of exciting. It is, I think. We can back it up to the first slide.
How's that?
I can't see it, but I think it's... What I wanted to do was try to characterize the book and introduce one idea, and then turn it over to my very able commentators and let them decide what's interesting or not about the book, and then we can follow from there. The tone setter is a quote from Martha Lagos and Lucia Damert, and it says, "Crime today is the topic that dominates the climate of opinion in the region and in each country and in each social segment. It's transversal, it's horizontal, it's vertical. Nobody disagrees. Crime is the issue." So that's I think what I've tried to do with this book is try to be analytical and comparative and try to enter into policy, because I'm very interested in the ways in which governments craft programs to deal with this area. So I wanted to sort of walk through just what these are about and then introduce an idea and let the commentators take over. The argument in the security traps is what Duncan's already mentioned. Why do cities or regions fall into a security trap, which I'll define in a second, and then it tries to elaborate this framework it's sort of like a map, to guide me through the rest of the book, and we can return to that if it's interesting. The second chapter is about foundational crime. And there are two of these that I look at in detail. One's tax evasion and the other is informality. Mexico is actually sort of middle of the Latin American spectrum with regard to tax evasion. It's not an outlier on either side. It's sort of normal. It's a low tax country, and it suffers the problem of both populism and oil, and so the taxes that it takes in comparison to the size of its economy are relatively limited. Informality is off-book economic activity. Mexico's $1 trillion, I don't know how much the GDP formally, but it's another 1/3 with regard to off-book activity. And this is really an important phenomenon because it links into varieties of organized crime. And it also, I think, shapes citizens' attitudes. Chapter 3 is about common crime, and I'll return to that idea in a little bit. But it's the idea of the crimes that are committed in the ordinary sense, particularly violent crime, and the question of whether it weakens or deepens democracy. And one of the sort of interesting things is crime victims tend to participate more in politics than non-victims. To me, that's kind of interesting. But it shows the resilience of a society that faces this problem of crime and tries to respond to it. So that chapter looks, as you say, the way in which crime evolves over time, and it investigates this other idea, which I think is important, which is the gap between fear and the reality of what the crime is. And the gap is really substantial. And there's a kind of inertia effect that the gap lingers after the crime begins to decline. The bulk of the book is about organized crime, which I think is really the main challenge that Mexico faces. So chapter 4 tries to be analytical about how to think about organized crime and criminal organization, which is the idea I'll develop, and then applies it to kidnapping. And you might think, well, why kidnapping? But I'll give you some reasons. Chapter 5 is about drug trafficking, and it tries to do a functional analysis of drug trafficking. I don't try to describe the organizations and the players so much, but what's the nature of the industry of drugs and the multiple types of drugs and the ways in which they're organized? What kinds of organizations evolve to do those kinds of functions, and how do they relate to the political system? Chapter 6 is about state responses, and the subtitle in the Valley of Transition is because when there's an established way of dealing with, the governments deal with their environments, when they try to reform, there's a period during which the performance actually declines. So the question is, Mexico's introduced a number of reforms, and where is it in the Valley of Transition? And then the escape routes, how the system might respond and find ways to move beyond. Politics, I'm really interested in linking systematically crime, corruption, violence, impunity with democracy as a regime and with the democratic state. And Mexico has a number of political problems that really shape the way in which it deals with crime. One is the legitimacy or the basis of agreement or the social contract has been broken. It was a country that had a populist agreement or a populist basis of agreement for 40 years, and powerful. Mexican populism is potent formula. And then with the neoliberal reforms of the 80s and 90s, that basis of legitimacy was broken. And there hasn't been a replacement for that basis of legitimacy, and still you can see now there's a sharp debate or a sharp disagreement within Mexico about what should be the basis of agreement. The party electoral system isn't very welcome. I can't think of party electoral systems that are well connected with public anywhere. Party electoral systems distort what publics want, but in Mexico's case, there's a kind of an important disconnect for a whole variety of reasons that we can get into. No re-election, party leaders control access to the ballot, public funding of parties and elections, but the parties, to put it too bluntly, run the country for their own interest. They don't really run the country in responding to problems that are dealt with in society. And then this problem, which is really critical, is the glacial pace of police justice reform. And it's so incredibly important because I'm one of those who believes that when institutions operate ethically and effectively, it can change behavior and values. And I tell you, I saw this with respect to the electoral system. If you look at before the electoral reforms were set in the 80s and 90s, the skepticism about elections was in the 70 and the 80%. But after the elections were run effectively, then the change in the values was really very, very important. And then deficits in trust and compliance, I'll show you in a second. The idea of security trap is, as Duncan mentioned, it's a situation, it's a metaphor really. It's a situation in which these flows of crime, corruption, violence, and impunity override the efforts on the part of government and civil society to introduce reforms. And I look at this, and this is an idea I take from Van de Velde by Brown, I look at this as an open-ended process of competitive state-making in which there are elements in society and government that are trying to implement an effective, legitimate, ethical system, and then there are elements in society and government that are operating to reproduce criminality and problems. Let me show you the next slide, please. Mexico's in the middle of the road in lots of ways, and one of them is with regard to the judiciary. So you get the outliers that are the high performers, Uruguay, Brazil, Venezuela's kind of a surprise. This is taken from Latino Barometro. And Mexico's sort of in the middle. It's a 30-40% range of those who have confidence. But show us the next slide. With regard to the police, Mexico is an outlier on the low side. This to me is very important because Mercedes Hinton has this wonderful, the police are the state in the streets. The police are who you interact with. And if there's confidence in police, then there's a basis for confidence in the broader system. I don't have to trust you. I don't have to trust these people if I can trust the police and the justice system to operate effectively. If I can't trust them to operate effectively, then other types of social trust don't work very well at all. Venezuela's kind of a surpriser. Could I look at the next slide, please? And the other is about compliance. We're talking about problems of crime, and we really need to talk about citizen compliance. And Mexico's an outlier on the low end with regard to respect for the law. It's there with Bolivia, Mexico, Guatemala. Do you actually obey the state's law? You get the outliers, Chile, Uruguay, Honduras is a surprise, but it's really fundamentally important that Mexico is on the low end with regard to that. We have the next slide. So that's kind of framing the book, and I want to introduce this idea of terms, maybe set the table for my commentators, we'll see. But I want to, this is very simple, but I think it's very important. I want to try to differentiate between common crime, organized crime, and criminal organizations. And they're terms that are rather loose and fluid, and we use them, and yet I think we need to be thoughtful about how we use them. Common crime, by and large, is almost biblical. We think of it as involving 3 or fewer, and it can be violent or nonviolent. It tends to be spontaneous, but it can be ongoing and repetitive. But it's this broad category that we treat as more diffuse types of crime. Organized crime is really the acts. These are the behaviors. It's acts involving 3 or more. There's legal definitions that have all kinds of predicate offenses that go with it. But it's usually 3 or more. It can be repeated. It usually is repeated, or it can be a one-time thing. It can be violent or nonviolent. So to give you an example, I think we ought to think about organized crime as the acts. We have a problem in the United States of Medicare fraud. And this kind of Medicare fraud involves doctors, billing staffs, patients, all kinds of specialists. And it is an act. And it could be done by a variety of types of organizations, but they're probably networks, and networks that are put together through professional contacts and that sort of thing. So we think of organized crime as the acts, and then I typically differentiate between enterprise crime and what's more important for the state, which is extortion. So enterprise crime is the crime for profit. It's crime that groups enter into. It could be petroleum theft, it could be armed robbery, it could be cargo hijacking, it could be kidnapping, it could be whatever. But these are acts that individuals engage in because they're taking money. It's important, but even more important is this territorial control where groups begin to extort. And they control territories, and if they get embedded, they can become kind of a parallel power to the government. And they present a problem that I think is interestingly different and more important. Criminal organizations come in all types. They can be varieties of hierarchies, they can be loose networks, they can be dysfunctional families, they can be all kinds of things. But what I want to emphasize is we need to differentiate types of criminal acts and then think about the types of organizations in order to understand the ways in which they engage with the political system, because it varies quite a lot. Next slide, and this is kind of a dense slide, and I'll dance through it when we come through later on. I think there are 2 kinds of stable equilibrium, if you can make sense out of this idea. One type of stable equilibrium is high, and that's this column that talks about evasion and tolerance. In high equilibrium, criminal organizations evade the state. The state tends to tolerate crime. In the United States, we tolerate all kinds of organized crime. You just have to look through the telephone directory and see the kinds of services you can get. But there's an agreement about what kinds of organized crime are tolerated and what kinds are not tolerated, and that it operates pretty well. And the middle row through here is this about state agencies. One of the problems that's so interesting is state agencies can be loyal, ethical actors, or they can be disloyal actors. And one of the central problems in the case of Mexico is the police operate as a disloyal actor too much. And so the instruments that are available to the state tend to be disloyal. In low equilibrium, it's an equilibrium of corruption and collusion. And this is a case in which criminal organizations find ways to either rent or buy or somehow use state authorities. And it's a collusive arrangement. State authorities enter into this, and sometimes the criminal groups actually run the state agencies, and sometimes the state agencies rather cooperate with. And the central problem here is that the state agencies defect. And the defection can be individual officers, it can be whole units, it can be a very important problem. I'll turn to kidnapping in just a second. And one of the really pervasive problems of kidnapping is police are actively involved, either retired police or purged police or active duty police, and it becomes one of the central problems on how to deal with the issue. There is an unstable equilibrium, which is one in which there's confrontation between criminal organizations and the state. It's sort of unusual because the costs of confronting are really very high. And so criminal organizations don't just confront the state, they would rather collude or evade. But in some circumstances, what's really interesting about Mexico is this period of outright confrontation between criminal organizations and the government. And what I think is also interesting is this is unstable and will be resolved over time. The violence will decline. And to me, what's interesting is what kind of new equilibrium will emerge from that, and whether it will be either more tilted toward criminal organizations or be more tilted toward an ethical state. Next slide. This is the idea, and Matt Taylor and I worked on this for a long time, and this is the form that it takes now. The idea here is to illustrate that organized crime can take a variety of different manifestations. And there are different types of organizations that can be related to different types of organized crime. And so this is an effort to disaggregate kidnapping. And why kidnapping? Kidnapping is the single most feared crime, at least according to surveys, in Mexico. Street assaults, kidnapping are more feared than homicide. And so if we're interested in the ways in which organized crime influences the political system, one of the most important is this sense of fear, or the installation of types of fear, because it affects behavior, I think, in important ways. So amongst these types of kidnapping, express kidnapping, and if you read through this table, there are different targets, there are different types of captivity, different types of organization, different types of interaction with the state, and the political effects are different with each. I ought to say here, let me stop here and say something. I've given this talk before, and I've given talks in which members of the audience have been touched by these issues of kidnapping. And I just, like a doctor talking about cancer, I just talk about it. And yet this is terribly, terribly important. And so I want to recognize that, I'm talking about issues that may have affected people in this audience really in terrible ways. And so I want to recognize that and tell you that I'm aware of that. The most important type for our purposes in the middle is ransom, kidnapping for ransom. This is what we typically think about. And the kinds of organizations that can be related to kidnapping for ransom can be a dysfunctional family in which there are extended networks out to relatives and so forth that operates over a period of months or years and can be territorially located or moved, or it can be a drug trafficking organization, fairly elaborate organization, which has a cell or a number of cells that can dedicate themselves to kidnapping for ransom as one of the sources of revenue. And it can evolve over time, and it can be an important one. But what I wanted to emphasize here is that we need to, and we can do this with drug trafficking as well. We can break it into its major types of drugs, and we can break it into the phases of trafficking, all the way from production through processing through distribution. And the types of organizations vary according to the type of drug usually, and the type of where it is in the industry and how it operates. And the reason it's important is states need to design policies that can intervene and deal with criminal organizations at different points and in different ways. And so we need to be able to think about the kinds of organizations that are attached to the types of crime in order for governments to devise policies that can work effectively. Then the last slide, and this is what I'm trying to suggest here, is thinking this is kind of the layer cake. It's not a very good image, but what we really want to think about is the ways in which types of criminality interact, because it acts as a system. And the most important, or an important point is that these kinds of problems rest in cultures of legal noncompliance or limited compliance, which sets up conditions in which there are problems of diffuse common crime, which interacts with these territory-bound groups. We don't have time to get into that, but maybe later if people are interested. But then at the top are these transnational smuggling organizations. And these interact in ways that transnational smuggling groups interact with territory-bound groups that also, I suppose, interact with common crime and then operate in these cultures of legal noncompliance. So to stop or to end the presentation, what I've tried to do in the book is think systemically and systematically about the ways in which crime, corruption, violence, impunity interact with democracy as regime and with the democratic state. And so there's an effort then to look at the flows between state and regime and civil society and crime and the other way around. So let me stop here and then see where the commentators want to go with their parts.
Thank you, John. Before we open it up for questions, we have three excellent commentators here. I'm going to begin with Flier Brown. Vander, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It is really a special honor and privilege to join John on the panel for the launch of his book. You know, I feel like this is one of the moments when you know you've arrived, when you move from the audience to revere at the feet of such a preeminent scholar of Latin American politics, security, crime, and now to be co-launching a new excellent book by John. And it is all the more special that apart from being such a preeminent scholar, John is a true mensch. I think there are many of us in the audience who really benefited from his generosity and kindness and mentorship. He's been guru to many of the very preeminent scholars of Mexico and Latin America, similarly like Michael has done with young policy analysts in Washington. So it's a great moment to be here. And all the more special that The Politics of Crime is a fantastic book. If you haven't bought a copy, you need to buy several. It makes for a gripping, fast read without jargon. And you know, it was interesting listening to Duncan as to what he picked as the values of the book. And I will, in fact, endorse many of the same. I mean, there are some excellent books on the history of drug trafficking in Mexico. There are other very nuanced studies of particular crime groups. What is very appealing about The Politics of Crime is the emphasis on the structural grounding and the broader exploration of these very large concepts that define society and define governance, whether formal governance or informal governance, the interaction between rule of law, concepts of legality and illegality, and their manifestation as official state institutions and unofficial actors, including organized crime actors. Like Duncan, I too very much like the chapters and focus on common crime and informal crime and their interactions and interplay with organized crime, as well as the very important focus then on policy responses. Let me make a few comments on the theme of The Politics of Crime, and I was very pleased to see that title. It is often rather controversial in the studies of crime to talk about its political aspects. And there was very much a fad in the late 1990s and 2000s, in the early 2000 decade, to say, look, insurgencies, military conflict have become apolitical. Ideology has disappeared, and groups like the FARC in Colombia are just criminals. And in many ways, this analysis and the policy prescription that led, in my view, were very fallacious and incorrect. But nonetheless, I would now flip it and then say that what we have often missed is that crime might be without ideology, and frequently it is conducted without ideology. But that doesn't mean that it is absent of political effects. And indeed, criminal groups, just like militant groups, just like official political actors, not only have political effects, they also often have political capital, although there is a great deal of variation in what kind of effects and what kind of political capital. And why is that? Because, and you know, it links interestingly in Mexico, and recall the Calderon Era when the highest official would dismiss the violence that was exploding in Mexico and suggesting, well, it's just criminals killing each other, so it doesn't matter, or in fact it might be a sign of progress because then there are fewer criminals. At the time when society was just shouldering this incredible burden and ultimately becoming very dissatisfied with the management. Not surprisingly, just like in the United States, where crime is often at the very top of political actors' agendas and politicians' responses, however good they are or not. And you know, the argument that it's criminals killing criminals might have been at all plausible were they killing each other on the moon or in a galaxy far, far away. But as long as the bullets were flying on the streets and in the middle of cities, this would have devastating, debilitating effects on society. And at the end, what is more political than the mitigation and structure and control of violence and money on the street? That is what formal politics are about. They are supposed to organize how power, political and economic and violent power, is mitigated. And when the official politics do not do that, then it's organized crime groups that can step into that lacuna. And in some cases, when organized crime groups are rather competent, or fairly competent anyway, they realize that in addition to directing the money on the street, how money is distributed to whom and how, and in addition to having a level of control, not full, but a level of control over the bullets that are flying on the street, they can also start providing a variety of what should be public goods. They can structure access to socioeconomic benefits, to jobs. Now, for me, living in the suburb of Washington, D.C., that might seem uninteresting, but to come back to John's concept of informality and the relationship between common crime, in societies, in countries where a large segments of population really have very limited social mobility, do not have easy access to legal jobs or socioeconomic benefits, those that are provided through illegal means might be as appealing as those provided through legal means. And anyway, those comparisons might be completely irrelevant because the only one that is accessible is the illegal means. And so if an organized crime group or whatever other actor can then sponsor access to jobs, such as by sponsoring poppy cultivation in Michoacan, or such as by allotting who will be able to sell pirated CDs in Tijuana, they can get a lot of political capital, even without having any overt defined ideology or any trappings of ideology or cloak of political legitimation, such as La Familia Michoacana, for example. And so at the junction of the problem for the state is the lack of alignment between illegality and illegitimacy. In an ideal world, what is legal is legitimate and what is illegal is illegitimate. And what the state needs to grapple with, and non-state actors such as organized crime groups can exploit, is the fact that many an illegal activity can be seen as very legitimate. That is at the core of the lack of rule of law and the acceptance of citizens of both criminality and their participation in it. Now, it also needs to be emphasized, however, that the state and the formal institutions are not innocent in the sense of not participating in crime. Often they very much do, and often they structure crime and use crime to their advantage as much as they become victims of crime to some extent. And in fact, the story of Mexico is the story of several sets of rebalancing, including the rebalancing between the power of the state vis-a-vis organized crime groups. And we are in yet unfinished phase of that rebalancing now. So John was very kind to refer in his talk and in the book to the concept of competition in state making. And my argument that we need to stop thinking about crime as merely an aberrant social activity to be suppressed, and rather think about crime as a competition over the allegiance of the population. Competition between the state and between non-state actors, criminal groups. And there are many ways then, if one adopts this concept of competition in state-making, that in which responses can be manifested, or that there becomes a whole range of responses beyond law enforcement. Nonetheless, law enforcement is critical, inescapable. It is the essential response that the state needs to adopt. And what's paradoxically happening with the Peña Nieto administration is that that aspect has almost dropped off. And is the weakest, least defined, most underdeveloped, and most ignored, I would make the argument, component. Well, a second component then, very broadly, is to focus on socioeconomic responses, precisely to realign the allegiance of the population toward the state and away from non-state actors and away from legality, to tighten or reduce the disjuncture between legality and legitimacy. And in this sort of broad second aspect, the Peña administration has been far more responsive and embraced this notion far more wholeheartedly than the Calderon administration, that was dragged kicking and screaming by the US to even think about something like Title IV and what happened, what emerged as Todos Somos Juarez. But unfortunately, a lot of the conceptualization of the Peña Nieto people of the socioeconomic programs, what they call polígonos, is very amorphous, very inchoate, and the implementation has much to resolve. And it could end up being a big wasted opportunity unless there is far more careful thinking about what are the hypotheses, what are the mechanisms by which some of these programs are then to result in greater legitimacy of the state and tightened bonds between the state and citizens. Is it really true that if kids have access to glasses and they can read the blackboard better, they will not become criminals? And being slightly facetious, I can explain in the Q&A where this reference came from. And let me now end with a few more comments. One is that essentially what is happening in Mexico is sort of three acts of rebalancing. One is a rebalancing among the criminal groups themselves. And I would posit that this, to a far degree than any other factor, explains the reductions in violence in the north. In places like Ciudad Juarez, in places like Monterrey. And yes, state and non-state responses, including by business groups, have played an important role, or have played a role in some cases. But in the end of the day, much of the changes are simply about a rebalancing on the criminal market. Because the very violent criminal market that we have seen in Mexico is a hugely aberrant market. This is not what criminal markets normally look like. This is not what drug trafficking markets normally look like. Successful drug trafficking markets can be very, very peaceful. Think places like Thailand, Indonesia, for example. The second set of rebalancing is the one that matters the most, and that's the rebalancing between the state and the drug trafficking or the criminal groups. Let me make it broader than just drug trafficking groups. And that's very much a work in progress. And in fact, there is a real danger that the faster and more effectively the first act of rebalancing happens, the more the second will drop off. And I think that the Peña people are potentially falling into that trap. As things are looking better because of internal crime dynamics, the reforms and changes in strategy that need to be pushed can easily fall off the radar screen. And the third set of rebalancing is the triangular one between the state, society, or the people, and the non-state actors like the criminal groups. And that rebalancing is the hardest to judge and hardest to comment on, because the scale is even further and longer than the scale of the first two. And again, I think that we are seeing some positive signs of at least recognition that this rebalancing matters. I think we are not yet seeing signs that the policies being adopted have the design they need to have to accomplish that rebalancing successfully. But it's not simply a function of the state, it's also a function of how the criminal groups themselves behave. And what's been very interesting, if extremely disturbing also to watch about Mexico, is just how incompetent the vast majority of the criminal groups, with the exception of something like the Sinaloa Federation, have been in calibrating the levels of abuse and delivery, abuse and predictability. At the end of the day, the most debilitating state is not one of repression of the Leviathan world, it's the one of unpredictability and capriciousness of violence. And that's what a group after group in Mexico has been falling into, the latest manifestation being the Templarios reacting to La Familia Michoacana, but even the militias now really struggling in calibrating that well. And that's terrible for Mexico in the short term, but in the long term, it suggests that it's easier for the state to come in and be more effective. But that means that the state cannot drop the ball and close the eyes and say it's a done deal now that violence has dropped down again. And so in conclusion, buy the book and continue reading John Bailey.
Thanks.
Vanda, thank you so much. It's terrific to have you here with your global knowledge of organized crime, and it's impressive that you've decided to study it rather than engage in it yourself, because you could make a lot of money. Claire, please, somebody who comes to this with years and years of research expertise in studying organized crime and security in Mexico, and somebody who looks at this very much from the policy point of view, given your position.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today, and congratulations to you on your new book. I would just say that how helpful it's been to me to have academics who write, maybe this is because you've spent your career in Washington, but who write from a perspective that's useful to policy analysts, because when we read new books that come out, it's very often that unless they're written by someone who's actually engaged in policy it's not useful, because it's either so academic and modeling and we can't relate to it. But I love the fact that your book, especially this one, combines a historical institutional approach, but also comparative politics, looking at Central America and South America, and then current issues and current strategies, and that it's so relevant for people who are looking at, like Vanda said, the U.S. response to what the new government's doing in terms of how we can support their security reforms and how the Merit Initiative should move forward. I feel like your writing is so useful to us, and I want to congratulate you. I also, it's useful to me because I feel that it's like when you look at the perception and the news on Mexico, it's so negative, and it also brings it back to the reality that Mexico is an outlier in some ways, but in other ways, its rates of crime are actually in the midpoint in Latin America, and that the perception that we have, because the violence increased so fast over such a short period of time, that actually Mexico is not unlike other countries, and in some situations is in a better space than many of the countries in Latin America, because it is an agent, because the government has agency and has the ability, and the society is a very strong one. It has, a middle class, a growing middle class that can actually make decisions, can actually have, if it wants to, can put political will towards solving some of these very difficult challenges. I also think the book's interesting because it says how Mexico is different than other countries in Latin America in both a positive and negative way, from its unique history, and also from the fact that there's a very low confidence in the criminal justice institutions as compared to other countries. There's high level perceptions of crime, even when the perceptions are much worse perception than reality, and that the organizations, the criminal organizations, are so much more violent and so much more complicated in the number and scope of crimes that they engage in. I think that's also very interesting. The fact that you highlight kidnapping, and that it's so important because it does create fear in society, and that this is what the current government kind of campaigned on, that they were going to do something about extortion and kidnapping and crimes that really raised fear in populations and among the private sector, and it hasn't been able to get a handle on it. And the fact that the kidnappings have increased so much in the last year or so is somewhat troubling to me. In general, I was looking at the book in terms of what are some of the pros and the cons that I can draw from what you've written in terms of where Mexico is today. And some of the questions that Duncan asked us to think about were, what kind of democracy will emerge in Mexico if the violence subsides, which it seems to have done since late 2011. And then, what democratic reformers, will they gain strength in this new equilibrium with the violence going down, or will it kind of slide back into sort of a tolerance of corruption and some level of crime? And I found that very helpful, because I feel like, there's some elements of hope and some elements of kind of caution right now when you look at Mexico. I see that, the fact that the parties have been able to come together to agree on key economic reforms that are needed to move the country forward, that kind of the fact that there's, an informality, a lack of formal employment, there's high inequality, there's a lot of reasons that have undergirded the problems in Latin America with crime. And the fact that, in Mexico, these different parties in the Congress have at least gone forward with the first step in implementing some needed structural reforms, and to education as well, is good. But the fact that you see now that the secondary laws that are needed to actually make these constitutional reforms take effect, many of them haven't even been passed, and whether or not they'll be implemented is the devil's in the details. And I feel like the fact that the session of Congress ends April 30th and all of these laws are supposed to be passed, and from what I've read, we're going to do a special session and this, and there's a corruption scandals that are distracting people from things, and the two other parties are totally divided, the PAN and the PRD. And, it seemed that the unity that was there, that agreed on the fact that we need to move Mexico forward, that it's Mexico's moment, that all of this optimism from last year, it could be in jeopardy. And so I also feel like the fact that you talked about perceptions of crime, and the fact that this government has toned down the media attention, giving it to arrests and seizures, and that has been able to kind of change the narrative. In some ways, it's good not to have a sense of hysteria, but then again, if people forget about the immensity of the challenge that the country is facing, particularly if you're based in Mexico City and you're not remembering the challenges that are going on in many of the states, you can lose the sense of urgency that you need to enact the judicial reform, that you need to move things forward in terms of police reform, and people who are in the seat of power are not thinking about it anymore. And so I think there's a danger that, if the perception is too good and too false, that there won't be a need for reform. I think that the fact that there is going to be a re-election, and that politicians may eventually be held accountable for their actions or inaction on security at the local level over the long term should help, because you'll have Alejandro Hope always talks about how governors, they don't care because it's not in their interest. And if they can choose between building a courtroom or building a hospital or something, or a road, they have no interest in building the criminal justice reform, because what's the point? I'm not going to be here when it's finished, and no one will hold me accountable. And I think that the re-election should help with that, with people being able to blame not only the federal government but also the mayors and the governors for their action. And I think there is a danger that the public will grow tired about talk about structural reform, and we're doing this because it's going to bring jobs in 5 years from now. And maybe that's why Peña Nieto's, one of the reasons why he's not popular in Mexico, is that there, at least in Central America, has been a tendency to kind of want quick fixes and want people to get tough on crime and do something about it, and create economic growth and create jobs. And if you're always talking about something that's going to benefit us in 10 or 20 years, if just as there's been a backlash against the judicial reform in some of the states that perceive it as being the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, or it's alternative dispute resolution, if it looks like those reforms are too leaning towards the rights of those who have been accused of crimes and not to victims, that, there could be a backlash against the unified code and things that people have talked about as being important for criminal justice sector reform. So, I hope the violence continues to subside, but I also hope that reformers and civil society keep up pressure on government officials so that there isn't this slide back into this equilibrium, this security trap, and that there are escapes. And I think that Mexico's democracy will grow stronger only if the government, keeps at it and keeps at these reforms and keeps at the structural reforms that need to be done, and that complacency doesn't prevail. So I really congratulate you on your book, and thank you.
Super.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Michael Shifter, but first of all, I'd like to say that when I first came to Washington about a year and a half ago, people told me that this was an incredibly cutthroat world, that nobody collaborates with each other, and, this is absolutely not true. Michael has been very generous. He was one of the first people to take me out to lunch in Washington, which I really appreciated. It made me feel very... I'm sorry? He didn't poison me. No, he didn't really know me at the time either.
It takes a while to have
Is this a Breaking Bad ricin kind of thing? Okay, fine. But anyway, I would like to extend my personal thanks to Michael for welcoming me to Washington and for always being willing to collaborate on these things.
Thank
Michael.
you. Thank you very much, Duncan. Duncan's given me 30 seconds to speak, so I appreciate his
Thank you very much,
generosity
Michael.
as
Moving
well.
on.
Okay. No, it's a great pleasure to join with the Mexico Institute, the Wilson Center, to host and organize this event. I want to thank Duncan and members of the Mexico Institute for their cooperation. Allison, thank you very much. I also want to thank Wanda and Claire for agreeing to comment, and you're cited throughout the book, so that has strengthened. And I want to congratulate and commend John Bailey for what I think is really a superb book, an enormous contribution. John and I have been colleagues at Georgetown since 1993. Over 20 years, and I've had a lot of students in my classes who have also taken John's, and they have just conveyed just a great deal of enthusiasm and excitement, precisely the course on crime in Mexico, and you just bring a lot of sophistication and rigor to the subject, which is welcome and important, I think. And so I want to commend you, and you should get a copy of this. There are only 20,000 left, so you might want to hurry and get one. Well, let me just say, I love two things just in the title of this book, which I think are realized throughout. One is just the politics of crime. Crime obviously is an important subject. It's got a lot of attention. There's a lot of work on it, but the politics of it are not really developed, I think, as much as they ought to be, because I think that's what really is crucial. And I think you really do it's really a great contribution in working out the political implications of that. And the second is the security trap notion. Because I think it is a trap, and it's a trap for a lot of countries, not just Mexico. And if one looks at the region overall, one can see a lot of very encouraging trends and heartening developments, but this is one that sort of is where many countries are kind of really struggling and seem to be stuck. And precisely for the reasons that you talk about, the weak rule of law, weak institutions, and the like. So I think you really put your finger on a fundamental problem and challenge. And just to illustrate this whole question, you talked about this in your presentation, but if I could just pick up on it, the whole notion of sort of the fear factor. And fear, you could look at the hard data, but fear is important in terms of how the politics are played out, both in terms of sort of organizing for reform and also mobilizing for sort of a mano dura. And that's what's really crucial in the way many of these countries go. What's important, you talked about kidnapping, and I know that Claire mentioned that as well. In the case of Colombia, and you talk a lot about Colombia in this book towards the end, the fact that kidnapping itself was reduced by tenfold over the first decade of this century was enormously important. Just that that category of crime had such a huge impact, I think, psychologically in the society. There were other changes as well, but if I had to sort of identify what was really important, it was the kidnapping from over 3,000 a year to 300 a year. That's an enormous change over a period of time. So I think that's important. That's extremely important. The other thing I really like about this book is how you deal with the question of drugs. Which we really haven't discussed, which is always in Washington, sort of how does drugs fit into this picture? And there's either a tendency to sort of overstate it, and then as a reaction to that, sometimes downplay it, as if it wasn't important. And I think you really give it the proper importance and weight in this book, which I think is really also very important, that it's a very important piece and a dimension of the crime, of the violence, but that one really has to focus on the institutional governance questions as the main framework and see this as part of that, as an element within that broader picture. And I think that's really a useful, I think a lot of us can learn from that as we go forward. I wanted to just mention the case of, and two final points, the case of Venezuela. Because, you frame the book, and not only the Mexico case, but you also talk about a number of other countries in Latin America in the context of political liberalization and market opening. Right. Well, the country that has most skyrocketed in the last 14 years in terms of crime and homicide is Venezuela in Latin America. Certainly in South America, and the countries of Central America, Honduras and the right, already had high levels of crime. Venezuela didn't. And you wouldn't really characterize Venezuela as one being marked by political liberalization and market opening over the last 14 years. So that poses, I think, an interesting analytical and policy challenge of sort of how does that fit in to this sort of broader analysis of crime. You mentioned in some of your charts that Venezuela, you kept saying Venezuela is a surprise because the public confidence, I think you said that because the public confidence was high, and yet the data are really alarming, and it's the second highest homicide rate in the world after Honduras today. And certainly in South America, it's the country that not only has increased but has skyrocketed and soared in the last, even by the government's own data. So that's an interesting case within this sort of broader discussion of democratic governance. And let me just make a final point, if I can. You started your presentation by citing Lucia Dammit and Marta Lagos talking about the importance of security. A lot of us here recognize that and agree with that. And yet you also say in this book that the data could be a lot better, the comparative data. Right. And I guess the question that I would leave the session in is to say, if this is the most crucial issue and the biggest risk for democratic governance and the rule of law in Mexico and many other countries, then isn't there real urgency to get really better data? And why isn't there that effort? I mean, the data is okay in some countries, but again, to really have solid data on the issue that's the most urgent one, I think is something for all of us to think about as we move forward. So anyway, I want to commend you, congratulate you. This is an enormous contribution. Now I see why all my students were so excited and enthusiastic about taking your courses all these years on this issue, because this is really, really a terrific book, John.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Michael. Only 4 minutes and 30 seconds over what I... Not quite sure what that is. Anyway, I would like to, there's a number of questions that have been put there for you, John. I'd like to take a couple more from the audience if we can. And I have to abuse my position and protect myself at home. My wife would kill me if I didn't ask you this question. Katie Putnam is currently doing research on why crime isn't a more important question in Mexican election campaigns. And I wonder if you have the answer, because that would help her to write her thesis. But let's take a few questions from the audience. Yeah, right here in the center, please, if we can get a microphone to the gentleman here in the center, and then the young lady behind.
Hello.
Hello. Is it coming through? Not quite sure what that is.
Hello.
my name is Antonio Caglia. I'm a student at Georgetown University. My question to you, Professor Bailey, is you mentioned the lack of trust in the police and the weak judicial system. So my question to you would be, what do you think the impact of the unified code will be in the justice system, and what do you think the impact of the unified police will be in the, well, not only in the perception, but on the real results that the police will have on the strategy between municipal police and local police and with the federation? Will that change things, or is that not the right way to go?
Good.
Thank you, Antonio. And of course, anybody on the panel will feel free to answer these questions. A young lady just behind there to the left, please.
One for you. Hi, Professor. My name is Stefania. I'm a student in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Hi. My question is, it's for all the members in the panel, actually. You talk about this rebalancing between groups. You talk about the rebalancing between the state and non-state actors, and also this triangle between society, state, and criminals. But I'm wondering, what about the balancing between state and society? There was a mention you mentioned also the importance of criminal justice, but what about victimal justice? Because I mean, if we're considering the interplay of crime in a democracy, I think that the safeguard of human rights is certainly essential, no? And well, we have a general victims law that was enacted by President Enrique Peña Nieto last year. It hasn't been implemented, and so I would just want to know your take on the victimal justice and the compensation to the victims.
Good. Thank you. We have another question here, and we'll close out the first round with that, and then we'll come to you on the first question on the second round, okay?
Thank you. Richard Downey from Delphi Strategic Consulting. And John, again, congratulations on this book, what seems to be a great book. And my question is actually somewhat similar to Antonio's, and in terms of the fact that you mentioned, John, yes, the low perception of confidence in the police, and that was, of course, one of the reasons why President Calderon brought the military in to address organized crime. And I noticed you do have a chapter on police reform. And within that context of escaping from this security trap, I'm assuming that police reform is an important part of this. You know, President Calderon was unable, that was one of his objectives early on, was to reform the police so he could take the military out. And President Peña Nieto has done some things, but he has also said the same kind of objective. And I wonder, do you talk about that you know, this aspect of police reform, and within that context of escaping the security trap, how do you address it? How do you see that go forward? Thank you.
Good. Go ahead. Good. On the issue of the unified code and the mando único, or the unified police, you remember that slide on kidnapping and the types of kidnappings and the complexity? Imagine 32 states that have their own criminal code and how they treat kidnapping in a variety of different ways. And it's a complexity introduced into law enforcement that's important. And so to have a unified code would uniformize, I suppose that's the right word, these different types of crimes across the states and make it more, make it easier for law enforcement to agree on how to distribute labor and agree on how to prosecute cases and agree on how to bring them forward. So the unified code is actually a big step forward. And this will be, I think, and it also goes to this point that what interests me a lot is how governments learn. And governments do learn, and there is an evolution. It's an ongoing sort of a tension between governments and these problems. And the unified code's a big step forward. The mando único, the unified police, has been adopted in here and there in different states in the country, and it's very important as well, because if one has, I don't know, 2,400 municipios, I can't remember how many there are absolutely, but if you have this complexity of the different city arrangements, and then 32 states, it's difficult to achieve coordination. And in a federal system as complicated as the Mexican system, coordination is absolutely essential. You remember, Monterrey is actually an agglomeration of 8 different cities, and Guadalajara is an agglomeration, I don't know how many, of 8 or 9 different cities. And to get these different entities to cooperate with each other is quite a challenge. And to have a unified police, that is, a state police that oversees the policing activities of the various municipalities, can be really important. Also, a unified police allows for what I think is very important, which is differentiation and specialization. To deal with kidnapping, you need an anti-kidnapping unit. To deal with money laundering, you need to have a very effective anti-money laundering unit. If cargo hijacking is a problem, there needs to be a very effective unit. And that can be better accomplished under a state-level organization than it can be under the cities. So I think these are important steps forward, and we'll see a whole variety of different levels of performance as they do go forward. The idea, and I'm so glad to see the Georgetown, I didn't salt the group with Georgetown students. I don't want you to think that I had a bus that brought the
Ringers.
yeah, that brought my students here, but I'm delighted to see them. I couldn't agree more that it's tremendously important for governments to operate ethically. And in Latin America and Mexico, this takes the idea of human rights. It's interesting, the discourse there is human rights. Discourse in the United States is about civil rights. And it's equally important. I mean, the respect for civil rights and the respect for human rights is absolutely essential in order to create this kind of democratic governance that actually works. On a more practical level, what's absolutely important is a citizenry that has confidence in their police because they'll provide information to their police. And police can't really operate very effectively unless they have this kind of good interaction with their civil society and make it operate effectively. Police reform, the third point, Felipe Calderon has a quote. He did an interview with the New York Times, and it's words more or less, when I leave here, the thing I really want to build is an effective police. That's what he says. I really want to build this police. And so he put a lot of effort into it and a lot of resources into creating a federal police, and the jury's still out on the quality of the federal police, and I've not yet seen an independent assessment of them. We hope it's a step forward. But I can only reiterate that an effective ethical police is the beginning point of an effective government response to these problems of criminality. It's the kind of the sharp end of the spear is to have a police that operates ethically and effectively. And then the rest of it is about a justice system that operates effectively, and then the coordination of different kinds of agencies that can deliver this whole of government response to these problems that it's so difficult to achieve. But the police is the first step, an absolutely essential step. And I'm optimistic that there will be advances in building an effective police. But right now, the bulk of the evidence is it hasn't been accomplished, because I think there will be a tipping. That is, once there's an effective police in a locality, there will be a tipping of confidence in government, and that will lead to perhaps a virtuous cycle of building of confidence in the broader system. But we begin with the police. So I don't know whether the others.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to make some additional comments on the issue of police reform and Mando Unico as part of it. I often tell our intervention forces and government officials that police reform is the single most difficult reform a country can undertake. Doing military reform is immeasurably easier than doing police reform for a variety of reasons. Doing major economic restructuring is still immeasurably easier than doing police reform. And in fact, there are very few cases in the world where there has been effective police reform, often facing quite different set of challenges than what Mexico is facing. That's not an excuse for not doing it. It is critical and essential. But it's also a very lengthy process. And although President Felipe Calderon said that the hallmark of his administration should be police reform, I think that the administration fundamentally underestimated the difficulties and length that it takes to do effective police reform, and set of a set of other strategies that were at a very different pace and created whole lots of problems than police reform could. And the danger, as I alluded before in my talk with the Peña people, is, I think, a dropping of focus on what needs to take place on police reform. I am a bit more agnostic than many of my colleagues, and perhaps John, with respect to Mando Unico. I think that it can be somewhat of a distraction from the core issue that needs to be resolved, and that is that local police forces are very poor. and that they need to be improved, particularly because you need to change perceptions in order to change the alignment between state and society. So to the extent that local forces are very incompetent and very corrupt and function essentially as private militias of local politicians, they're a prescription for disaster. Is that really resolved by the fact that they will now be rolled into a national, perhaps at least state, unified command? Well, perhaps it could. But it might also not resolve anything. An equally disastrous choice would be if you have state forces, state police forces centered in the state and deploying to municipalities only after crime occurs, as happens already in many parts of Mexico. So whether it's part of Mando Unico or part of a different system, the key issue to resolve is to strengthen the effectiveness, interaction with community, and ultimately crime reporting at local police forces, which might be part of Mando Unico, but Mando Unico might also not resolve that. And let me suggest that there is a great variety of effective police forces with different levels of unity. So in the United States, we have probably the most disunited police forces anywhere in the world I can think about, and yet with zillions of agencies, even at the local level. Just drive on the street and watch state trooper, this kind of county police, you will see tremendous amount of them. And yes, coordination is an issue, and it's always something that one cries about in policy, whatever the policy is, if only there were bigger coordination. But at the end of the day, what enabled the effective police reform that the United States went in, one of the most effective countries to conduct police reform in the Bobby Kennedy era, from a very incompetent, very corrupt police force, was precisely that police forces were so disunified and that Bobby Kennedy could use the feds and the justice system to go after local municipal police departments that might have not, and state police departments that might not have been available in the unified system. So I go back to saying the key issue that Mexico needs to resolve, or a key issue that Mexico needs to resolve with respect to police reform, is better local police forces, however they are tied into the system. And the second that they need to resolve is better strategic intelligence, which continues to be lacking. And finally, it's about vetting and consistent vetting, not just one-time vetting when police are being recruited, but vetting throughout the existence of the police force. Because although it might require an anti-kidnapping unit to deal effectively with kidnapping, and specialized interdiction units do better for high-value, for interdiction purposes than other units, they are also the best position to become the top traffickers and the top kidnapping actor in the country. And so vetting and continual vetting and oversight and multiple channels of oversight are as important as specialization.
Good.
Thank you.
Good.
Yes, please. Number one for the second round.
Thank you. My name is Graciela Reyes. I am an independent scholar, former representative of Uruguay to the Organization of American States. And my question is, we have been talking about the police. And a few days ago, the Commission of Security and Development of Michoacán made an announcement that starting May 1st, the self-defense will disappear and a state rural police will be in place. And they will allow also to have guns at home, but not in the streets. And my question is, do you see any possibility that this self-defense, auto-defense, as in Michoacán, could be institutionalized and registered from now to May 1st?
Thank you. I don't know if, Michael, you want to come in on that at some point, but yeah. We've got three questions here, so why don't we take all these three questions together, and then we can, we'll move on to the third round. Yeah, we'll come back to you. There'll be time for another one. Don't worry.
Hi, I'm Barbara Cedillo from Georgetown University. I'm in John Bailey's class. Mm-hmm. My question is in regard to kidnapping, and how would you explain criminal organizations shifting from drug trafficking into common crime, kidnapping, extortion, and what do you think the state's response should be?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Pedro Valenzuela, also a student of Professor Bailey in Georgetown University. And my main question is, how would you link or vinculate effectively the communication of the government to communicate the strategy against crime with other social needs, specifically in terms of Mexico, because I think that the examples on Monterrey and on Ciudad Juarez show us that without the community, any progress could be done in crime.
Hi, my name is Jose Lobo, also Georgetown University student. Seems we're getting extra points. So. No, just kidding. First of all, congratulations.
Lack
Professor.
security here.
Congratulations. Only someone like you can gather such a remarkable panel, so congratulations for that and for your book. And my question goes, a lot of people in Mexico, when seeking for escape routes, like you mentioned in your chapter 7, turn to Colombia as an example.
Right. Colombia.
And you discussed there that even though there may be some examples, it may be not all the way to follow. Can you develop on that, on what are the similarities, the differences, and what can we take from there?
Super.
At the risk of overloading everybody, I'm going to take one last question on this round, if that's okay, at the back here, for the gentleman.
My name is Carlos Indacochea from the George Washington University, so I didn't take the chartered bus.
Welcome. Welcome.
It is tempting because two comparisons have been made with the United States, one on organized crime in Medicare, and the other one about Bobby Kennedy's action on reforming the police. And it is a question that I have made before. What level of relationship and functionality is there between organized crime in Mexico and that in the United States? Because we are in a country where massive sales of drugs occur and where the highest returns for those sales are realized.
Right.
And yet, organized crime seems to stop at the border.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. The question about Michoacan and the self-defense forces, and I don't know the case in a granular way. We use that word a lot. And so I don't know the substance of it, but I would ask whether the transition is really a relabeling of the reality on the ground and calling it something else, and the state coping with how to deal with a situation in which it really can't be present with state forces. And so there are spontaneous civil society forces that rise up, and then the state faces this terrible prospect. What if this becomes replicated in other states? And so it needs a policy response, and maybe the short-term policy response is more symbolic, that is to redesignate it as something and try to negotiate some kinds of arrangement than it is real. But to actually implement something substantially different by May 1st strikes me as very, very unlikely. The kidnapping notion is I think it's pretty straightforward. When governments put priority on one set of activities and really begin to repress it, for example, fracturing or fragmenting the trafficking organizations, they typically go into other forms of criminality. And the two most prominent ones now are extortion and kidnapping. And the kidnapping generates revenues, which are absolutely essential to maintain the organizations. And the extortion becomes, I think, a problem that's even in some ways more significant than the trafficking itself. But I think it's this resilience, it's this ongoing struggle between governments and criminal organizations, and when governments really target and repress, then there's this response. So the strategic thinking that Vanda mentions is governments know that when they target a geographic area or a type of criminality, it have these repercussions. So strategic thinking is two or three steps ahead. What are the responses that governments need to be thinking about when they act here, and they know there will be responses over there. How to explain organized crime to a community? What I'm finding very interesting right now is President Peña Nieto has put all of his attention on productivity. And if you look at his reforms, they're really components of productivity, energy and labor and communications and so forth and so on. And now I'm hearing Videgaray, who's the Treasury Secretary, talking about how insecurity limits growth. And I hear Carstens, Mr. Carstens, who's head of the central bank, talking about how insecurity limits growth. So one way that communities can be drawn in as sort of allies against the sort of abstract notion of fighting against organized crime, this is a major problem with regard to productivity and growth. How to measure it may be another question, but I think it intuitively makes sense that insecurity is a break against that. Colombia is an example, and in the book, I think the Mexicans have looked to Colombia for a long time, and the U.S. in some ways uses Colombia as its proxy for its own policies in the region. And there's this long debate about Plan Colombia and so forth, and whether it's successful or unsuccessful and so forth. What I find in the Colombian case, what really travels effectively are tools and techniques. Intelligence, mobility, logistics, types of ways of responding to organized crime. What doesn't travel very effectively is the huge costs that Colombia went through with regard to human rights, with its extraordinary costs. And Mexico, and in the book I try to deal with what would this look like in the Mexican case. It would be absolutely horrific if the Mexican government adopted policies as the Colombians did in the 90s. And then as the Colombians got into 2000 and farther on, I think they also learned about how to more appropriately deal with their problems of criminality. About the United States and Mexico organized crime, you've touched on something that interests me a lot, which is we use this term cartel as though we know what we're talking about, and we really don't. And we use this term federation as though we could name and do a diagram, and we really can't. And we talk about zetas and all these other familia. And what I always find interesting is if they find a house with $35 million in cash and a stash of drugs, and it's in Toluca, they'll call it the Toluca cartel. And so we don't know about how these organizations operate. But one of the most interesting facets to me is the way in which the drug industry is organized. And it can be organized in multiple ways. And my own hypothesis is these organizations operate differently. And so one organization may have its backward linkages to producing areas and may carry forward to the border itself or to the distribution to dealers that take it down to the street level. I think it's very unusual for a trafficking organization to reach the street level. I don't think that happens. And so I think it's like the hourglass, the famous metaphor, that the real problems come into the areas of transit into the United States. And once it's in the United States, it becomes, the other part of the hourglass. It distributes. And the problems of the criminality and the violence are really localized, and they're there. I mean, if you look at the problems of criminality, but they aren't as concentrated as they are in the trafficking areas themselves. So I think we need to spend a lot more time looking at the ways in which organizations operate in order to do these different functions, and we don't know really how it operates that well, except that once it gets into the United States, it becomes dispersed and at the local level.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on this, Wanda?
I would like two comments. One on the kidnapping. And Duncan, you were very kind to say that I could make a lot more money being a criminal than being an anti-crime analyst. But let me give you a gratuitous advice. If you plan to run a criminal organizations, do not go into kidnapping. It is an extremely inefficient activity with very uncertain financial returns, huge headaches, almost no political capital, or I should say no political capital, really an inability to hire the local community, and a guarantee that you will face annoyances. Now, the question is, why do so many criminal groups engage in kidnapping in some places? Yeah. And John brought extortion, and I would, maybe it was Michael, I would draw the contrast between the Yakuza and the Italian Sicilian mafia, which were all about extortion for centuries. Yet there was very, very little kidnapping. Kidnapping would only happen when an actor misbehaved. It was a form of punishment rather than generalized ransom for all the reasons that I suggested. Kidnapping is inefficient. You need to keep the victims alive, at least for a while. You need to hand them over after ransom is paid. The risky proposition, much easier to do anything else. Nonetheless, it's tempting, and it's especially tempting in situations like in Mexico, where kidnapping increases, and any other suggestion, like virtual kidnapping, seems to be plausible enough that people are paying. Yep. But even in the kidnapping markets, there are huge variations, and Mexico is, again, very interesting. A while ago, I was doing a TV interview, and was asked whether of the three places I go to, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Mexico, where would I most like to be kidnapped if I had to be kidnapped? And I said, look, Somalia, because the chance I would survive are very high. Yes, I would be looking at several months being held hostage by the pirates, but conditions were not too bad. They have become worse since as a result of policy responses. The odds were very good that I would make it out and that I would have decent kidnapping. It used to be Yemen was the best when the kidnapping victims were in hotels and really treated very well. In Afghanistan, things would be fairly dire. the chance I would survive would not be negligible, but nonetheless, I would be looking at easily 5 years of kidnapping, and chance I would be resold among several Salafi groups, very unpleasant conditions, but it was quite possible that I could survive at the end of the day, especially if I escaped. And I said the least place I would like to be kidnapped was Mexico, because what happened in the Mexico kidnapping market, as inefficient as the entire criminal market became, was that people would be held hostage, ransom would be paid, and they would still not be released. Yeah. That's a really stupid thing to do if you are a crime group. Why should anyone pay you the second time along? So people would have to pay twice or 3 times a ransom for the release of a family member. And the way then the criminal groups dealt with it, the rational response would be to say, okay, we drop this policy and we become more reliable and we'll become the most effective kidnappers because we release the victim. Instead, the response was to torture people very, very quickly in a really gruesome manner, so that the family would pay, despite the lack of assurance that the victim would be released, because of just the trauma of watching people being tortured very quickly in the process. So I use that as an example to show how there's huge variations in how criminal markets in the same crimes are manifested. And one comment on does crime stop at the US border? No, it doesn't, but it's still an excellent question, because there is a marked difference in how the same groups operate in Mexico and in the United States. There's a lot of interesting reporting and police reporting on Sinaloa's operations in California, in Chicago, for example, and by other Mexican groups in other parts of the United States. And they behaved very well. And this is what I sometimes say, that to be facetious, that the purpose of law enforcement is to make good criminals. Yeah. Especially in transactional crimes where driving incidents down is an elusive goal, there needs to be restraints. And those restraints on behavior, like you peddle drugs but you don't torture or kidnapping victims, comes from signals from the state. And this is where the rebalancing between the state and the criminal groups in Mexico